One of the really fascinating things, if you go back through Australian history, is looking at all the major party schisms and looking at the causes of those schisms. And if you look with a fair bit of hindsight, a lot of them, you just go, bro, was it really that deep? Like, did you really need to break fellowship over that issue? Like, I know conscription felt like the big issue when you're in World War One, but like the war ended a year later and congratulations, you just split your political party over the issue of conscription. And I'm more talking to the pro-conscription guys rather than the anti-conscription guys, because it was the pro-conscript people who walked away from the party. Now, obviously, it wasn't just the issue of conscription. It was the, I guess, binding nature of the Labor Party, which restricted what they felt was their ability to exercise their free conscience by advocating for conscription. But one thing I need to give the Liberal Party a lot of credit for, or the Conservatives a lot of credit for, all their schisms or all their rebrands are actually them extending the olive branch. Like the Nationalists became the United Australia Party because they extended the tent and actually gave up the leadership of the party to a Labor guy in Joey Lyons and brought in more people from outside the tent to make themselves a more potent political force. The Labor Party, their schisms are actually them shooting themselves in the foot. And so if I am to give the Tories credit, a lot of the times they were able to see the bigger picture far better than the Labor Party was. But I want to focus on one guy who I felt saw the bigger picture really effectively. He's probably a guy you don't know unless you were part of the Bug Holden Academy, which obviously do join and put an application in because you will learn all about this guy, that I think needs to be admired, but also at the same time loses his mind at the end of it. His name is James McGowan. And what is particularly, or that should say 1891, not 1991. Whoops. What I think is particularly interesting about James McGowan was he was the equivalent of Richard Hatch in Survivor Season 1 USA. If you don't know Survivor, basically the premise of the show is you're on tribes, you vote each other out until there's one person left, one person or two people left. Two people need to convince the jury that they deserve the $1 million because they played the cleverest strategic game. In the first season, the votes were going all over the place because there was no organization. Richard Hatch comes in and Richard Hatch gets a block of, I don't know, like 3 or 4 together and goes, hey, if we vote as a block, it's first past the post. Like, our vote will be so potent that we can decide who goes home every week because none of them are organized and will actually be organized. And sure enough, it's him who ends up being the puppet master. He ends up winning Survivor Season 1. And who would have thought that voting as a block is actually far more potent than everyone just voting on conscience and casting their vote in a million different directions. Well, either yes or no, but on the pretext of a million different justifications. Now, over time, Survivor has become incredibly sophisticated where you not only have alliances, you have sub-alliances, you have fake alliances, you have factional deals where 2 different alliance leaders will make an arrangement with each other that they veer the votes away from each other so that they can both preserve them. So it's very sophisticated now, but it wasn't in Season 1. Same is true of obviously political blocks. In the early days, it wasn't very sophisticated at all because votes were going everywhere, but now party discipline is so well organized that you have factions and sub-factions and power sharing between the factions, and the Labor Party has learned from a century of mistakes. But James McGowan cottoned onto the idea of caucus supremacy very early on and the need to be bound by whatever caucus comes to the conclusion of. If you don't know, caucus is basically just the internal party room where they decide how they're going to vote. And the reality is this is often way more heated than Parliament. Like in Labor, punches have historically been thrown at these quite a fair bit. But basically, in James McGowan's day, a little bit of context, 1891, we have a red slide and the Labor Party, having just formed in New South Wales off the back of the 1890 maritime strike, end up actually picking up 35 seats in Parliament. Now, it's they're the third power behind the Free Traders and the Protectionists, but they hold the balance of power. And so basically, their first decision is to decide who we're going to back, because we can either back the Protectionists or we can back Henry Parkes and the Free Traders. And so they all come together, they have a vote, and the Free Traders, or the people who want to side with the Free Traders, end up winning the vote, which means by the own party rules, all 35 votes should go to supporting Henry Parkes and the Free Traders. Now, a lot of them didn't. We actually had 8 Labor members who defected, and James McGowan, who was actually a protectionist, he wasn't a free trader at heart, his argument was, whoa, guys, our MO for being in Parliament is that we want to represent the workers in the fight between capital and Labor. Protectionism versus free traders, that's an industry versus industry war. We're not representing the workers, when it comes to free traders, there are workers who win, there's capital classes who win. When it comes to protectionism, there are capital classes who win, and there are workers who win, and then there's others that lose, depending on what industry you're in. It's industry versus industry. We're not about internal industry fighting. We are about the workers in every industry having the strongest possible foot and strongest possible representation. So whatever we think here, I'm a protectionist. I am pro-protectionism. I'm pro-tariff. However, the party room has spoken. We need to get behind one of these guys. We agreed to get behind Henry Parkes. If we do that, we'll be able to get concessions from Henry Parkes and actually achieve major reforms. And by the end of the decade, like the free traders and the protectionists just diminish ever more so in power. And by the end of the decade, we have Billy Hughes, who at that point was in the Labour Party, able to actually get from the protectionists a deal to enshrine the New South Wales Court of Conciliation and Arbitration to basically get on the front foot and set fair working conditions. 1899, 1900, I can't remember off the top of my head, it was one of those years. And Billy Hughes was able to effectively get that deal done before Federation happened. Now, that does not happen if they don't have caucus supremacy. McGowan was the adult in the room who very much caught on to the fact that whatever our secondary differences are, we need to know what's our primary justification and what's our secondary justification. So primary issue is workers' rights. If we are not able to adequately protect the rights of workers, that is when we consider breaking fellowship and possibly splitting or moving away from this party. However, on the issue of protectionism versus free trade, that is not what our party is about. It's very much a secondary issue which you can have your own proclivity on, but it's not the thing that defines our party. And he was very clear in creating a dichotomy of primary issue versus secondary issue and making sure that the Labour Party was entirely unified behind the primary issue. What ended up happening was the actual original leader of the New South Wales Labour Party wasn't James McGowan, it was a guy called Joseph Cook. If you have been watching a lot of Mystery M history, that name might ring a bell because he ends up being a Liberal Prime Minister down the track, but he actually started off as the New South Wales Labor leader. And Joseph Cook, who was a free trader at heart, just did not agree with the premise of we should be pledged. Like, even though he got his way the first time of asking, he didn't agree with the premise of being pledged to be bound by whatever caucus came to the conclusion on. He was like, that's a gross violation of my individual liberties in Parliament. I am going to leave. He ends up joining the Free Traders and then later ends up joining the Liberals when the Free Traders and the Protectionists merge. What is ironic is in his early days in Parliament, he is very much pro-individual liberty. I need to be able to exercise as much discretion and as much judgment in Parliament as I want, and I shouldn't have any structure superimposed on me to prevent me from doing that. But we see him leave and join the Free Traders, and then when the Free Traders and the Protectionists merge together and agree to do tariffs, he goes along with protectionism because he saw the bigger picture. He saw, okay, the fight is now no longer between, even though he was once a Labour guy, the fight is no longer between protectionism versus free trade. It's about capital versus labor. And we need to unify behind capital right now if we're going to have any chance of achieving our long-term policy objectives, because the trade issue has very much become a secondary issue with the rise of the Labour Party. As he grows in political wisdom and as he matures, he ends up coming around on the idea of we need to be bound by some sort of superimposed structure on the party, and I can't just constantly act in accordance with what I think is the right thing to do or what I think is the best foot forward. And so that dichotomy that James McGowan created was really important. Primary fellowship versus secondary fellowship. You hear this in churches all the time, actually. Like, amongst Christian churches, there's like primary issues. Like if you don't believe in the divinity of Jesus, they will go, okay, that makes you a heretic. But then the secondary issues. Do you baptize your kid as a child, or do you baptize your kid when they're old enough to make the decision for themselves? These are what's called secondary issues. And so Baptists that are pro do it when they're old enough to make their own decision, and Anglicans and Catholics that are much more pro baptize them when they're an infant. Obviously, we're not saying that because we're not saying you don't belong to the church because you want to baptize at a different age. And so it's really the same principle that we see that James McGowan created. And I think this is really important because in politics, particularly right now, I'm seeing it with gas. We've seen it earlier with like Chris Minns and the New South Wales Police, which I obviously vehemently disagree with, just to get that on the record. That was a really dark day for the New South Wales Police, which unfortunately we've had many dark days. But we saw this statement all the time. How is this not a red line? Why are you not leaving the Labour Party over this? And we see One Nation do the same thing to Liberals, right? It's like, how is this not a red line? How are you not leaving the party if Susan Ley is the leader that they have chosen for you? And again, it just comes back to primary issue versus secondary issue. If the Labour Party severed ties with the unions, then I'm out. That's because it's no longer a Labour Party, right? But if they take a foreign policy decision, which I disagree with, which they tend to often do, that is a secondary issue. It is not the primary reason as to why I'm in the Labour Party. And for those going into politics, it's really important to get that clear. What are my primary issues versus what are my secondary issues? And I think that's just numerous examples of people who see the bigger picture and don't get bogged down in the weeds. Ironically, James McGowan does end up getting bogged down in the weeds. By this point, he's pretty impotent. He became what effectively Bob Brown became to the Greens, where he was a figurehead, but power resided much more in New South Wales, the guy called William Holman. And during the conscription referendum, it's so funny, the old guard of Labor, so like the guys that helped really strengthen the party in the 1890s, Billy Hughes, William Holman, James McGowan, they basically go, oh, it's all of these unappreciative trots who wouldn't have used the word trot at the time for obvious reasons. It's these unappreciative trots who don't want to basically pay tribute to the empire and defend the empire here. Stuff them. We're going to do our own thing and get rid of them, and we'll kind of retain the old guard. And again, if they had just kept calmer heads in that situation, we could have avoided the schism of Labour. And obviously, I think Labour in the long run, like iron sharpens iron, like they were forced to re-innovate the party. They were forced to extend a bigger olive branch to the Catholics that were anti-conscription. Like it helped refine the Labour Party to actually become more resilient because they had that hardship to begin with, but it's not a prescribed strategy that you would recommend. Anyway, he ends up losing his head on conscription, in my opinion, and took it overboard, and it just wasn't that deep. It didn't need to be this thing that broke fellowship in the Labour Party, because they're not foreign policy does not actually define their party, its workers' rights. Which, if you're on the anti-conscription side, there's more of a justification to break fellowship over that, because it's the working classes that are getting conscripted to die on behalf of capital, as was John Curtin's argument at the time. I think the anti-conscripts have a stronger argument for breaking fellowship there, not necessarily the pro-conscripts. That really is just for them just a numbers issue in fighting a war. Anyway, we'll fast forward through to Robert Menzies, because I think he does a very similar thing on the Conservative side. So Menzies is at first a United Australia Party Prime Minister, and the UAP just strongly whistles about conservatism. Conservatism is the way forward. It's, dignified gentlemen that know what's best for you. Trust them, trust the old guard, the educated class, and it's really effective in the 1930s, particularly during the Great Depression. A lot of people are like, oh, I don't know if I'm willing to trust these radical Jack Lang ideas. I think I'm going to stick with the more conservative approach. And that works really well for the Conservatives. But World War II happens, and Menzies is rendered a little bit impotent because basically he's seen as being a simp for Churchill and unable to actually advocate for Australian interests in the Pacific. John Curtin is making a lot more noise about it. And the confidence in the Conservatives to handle Australia's business just diminishes very quickly, because it's like, oh, the Conservatives actually don't know that much. They are just part of the old English aristocracy, and they just do whatever Churchill wants them to do, and actually didn't exercise any sound judgment in this situation. It was actually the socialist John Curtin that was banging on about Japan that proved to be more right. And so then like Robert Menzies, he had to re-pivot and re-strategize, and that's where we see the forgotten people. And what he does is he makes the messaging of the Conservatives be a lot more middle class, and obviously there were policies that then followed with that, and a lot less anti-conservative. Conservatives were very anti-dole. They shamed people for going on the dole in the 30s. He doesn't do that. He expands the welfare state throughout the 1950s and does so shamelessly. There's a number of Labour Party people quite like Robert Menzies for that reason. He's not a John Howard by any means. He was much more pro-intervention in the economy. Anyway, we see the shift from conservatism towards being a middle-class party. We see it with the Albury Conference as well. It's not just the UAP who rebrands. They bring in other conservative groups as well. And Menzies just realised, we need to get everyone to go against we need to unify everyone we can against the Labour Party right now, because that is our only option of forming government once again. I think Gough Whitlam, we see, he was someone who saw the bigger picture as well, when it came to campaigning, not when it came to governing, in my opinion. But Gough Whitlam, the Labour Party was in a really dire state when Gough Whitlam became the federal leader. So you not only had the 1955 Labour split that happened a decade before, Arthur Colwell, who initially looked like he would lead the Labour Party back into government, had horrifically failed in 1966. Harold Holt ends up winning with the biggest margin in Australian history up until that point. And the Liberal Party were like, sweet, we've got this on lock. Now, even before Harold Holt, how should I say this, got in a Chinese submarine, Gough Whitlam had made tremendous gains on Harold Holt throughout the 1967 calendar year. And that put a lot of pressure on Harold Holt, and Gough Whitlam continued to apply that pressure all the way up until when he got elected. And the biggest thing that I think that Gough Whitlam did that helped the Labour Party turn the tide was he did an intervention on the Victorian Labour Party. He was like, okay, since the Catholics have gone, the left have been running the show. They've been doing a rather punitive campaign against the Catholics in Victoria. We're seeing a similar thing in WA. I'm going to do an intervention to basically go like, hey, you need a power share with the right, and you need to stop engaging in either purity politics or vendetta politics internally because you were mad at what the Catholics did in 1955. just put that to the side. That's not going to help us win. If we're going to have any shot at winning, we need the Catholics on side. There's not only a lot of Catholics, a lot of them are working class, so predisposed to vote Labor, but they have a very clear hierarchical structure. And if we don't have those bishops on side, then the bishops will be making noise about us, and that's going to cost us electorally really badly. And so Gough Whitlam, it was when he was talking to the Victorian left, that was when he said only the impotent are pure. Or only the pure, I can't remember what order he said it, but you get the point, right? If you are so focused on having pure politics and making sure that you are right on every single issue and you are consistent with whatever principle you want to espouse, you're not going to win and you're not going to be able to change anything. And so he was very much of the thought of politics is about material benefits, not about an exercise in morality. Anyway, I think when it came to Gough Whitlam governing, I don't think he showed that same big picture thinking. I think he did get bogged down in a couple of policy fights. I think in his mind, he thought we're not going to be around very long, so let's just ram through as much as we can to make sure that we can just stick as much on the Conservatives as possible so that when they get back in, it's a nightmare to unwind everything that we've done. But you also just read like any biography about the Whitlam government and it was just objectively dysfunctional. Like I said, as a Labor guy, everyone that had any sort of access to the cabinet were like, yeah, that was an absolute shambles. I think Paul Keating's biography, The Big Picture Thinker, ironic, we're talking about big picture thinkers today and Keating doesn't even get a shout out. But you read that biography and you get a real sense of just how dysfunctional Gough Whitlam's cabinet was. So Bob Hawke sees that and he's like, okay, like props to Gough Whitlam. He's made us an electable party again, but he hasn't made us a party that the public trust to govern. We can win on anti-conservative sentiment, but the public doesn't actually trust us to govern with any sensibility. We're going to change that. We're going to build consensus. We're not going to be radical in the pace in which we run through our agenda. We're going to pace it out and try and see these reforms entrenched by having longevity. Medicare will only survive if we can get 3 or 4 terms of it, the public gets a real taste of it, and the Conservatives can't come in and go, we need to unwind that because it just becomes part of the public consciousness. And so Bob Hawke ran a much more pragmatic government, and I would argue, and I don't even think pragmatic's the right word because Gough Whitlam, in my opinion, was very pragmatic, but he ran a much more disciplined government. It was a lot more sensible. And that meant that his reforms were entrenched over time, and that Howard, who was a very big anti-Medicare person to begin with, when it came to 1996, the best that he could do was scale back Medicare and boost the private sector rather than actually undo Medicare entirely. So I think we see throughout history, and Howard himself, big picture thinker, right? He didn't get bogged down on the Medicare issue. He conceded defeat, moved the goalpost to somewhere else, and ran on a battle that he could actually win, which was the national debt that he ran very effectively on. So you see these figures on both sides of politics throughout history, and you see it's the big picture thinkers that don't get hung up on things that feel really important at the time, but actually don't end up being anywhere near as consequential as what it was made out to be at the time later on. Conscription, obviously that is a consequential issue if you're in 1917, but given the war ended a year later, it really wasn't of that much consequence to the national story arc of Australia. The thing that made it of consequence was the fact that everyone, lost their mind over it, and we saw this huge breakdown in relations between different factions of the Labor Party. Anyway, a couple of takeaways I think that are really important, whether you're a branch member, whether you're just an average voter, or if you have political ambitions. Number one is don't fall for the red line bait. This is always put up by minor parties because they're trying to take people away from major parties. Now, this isn't a knock on minor parties per se. Like I've made it clear that there are minor parties that do like. Ironically, as someone who is a much more, let's just say, moderate Christian when it comes to social reform. I think legalized cannabis is a sick party. I really like Jeremy Buckingham, even though I don't even know what my opinion is on legalizing cannabis. But anyway, with all those caveats out the way, minor parties often, like particularly ones that are trying to replace major parties and have ambitions of being major players at the table rather than just having their one seat at the table, their strategy is to try and demoralize people from the major party and draw them into voting for them. And that doesn't mean that they're wrong at all. It's just, in the same way that when an opposition leader criticizes a prime minister, doesn't mean the opposition leader is wrong. It's just, let's be clear, they have a very vested interest in not giving that government credit and in making sure discontentment brews. Doesn't mean they're wrong, doesn't mean they're being dishonest, but there is a very clear vested interest to frame things a certain way, so just keep that in mind. And I think one of the cynical ploys that a lot of minor parties do is they constantly hold up things. They go, red line, how is this not a red line for you? How is this not a cause for you to leave the party? And they take what often is a very legitimate grievance. Like the New South Wales police thing was horrific earlier this year when it came to Muslims protesting and Muslims praying. But obviously don't account for any of the context, which is like the New South Wales police has been a thorn in the side of every premier for a long period of time. Neville Wran, I know people frame him as corruption. I would highly recommend reading the book, The Assassination of Neville Wran by Milton Cockburn. It shows just how difficult it was to reform the New South Wales police. I would also recommend doing any reading on Bob Carr, because Bob Carr tried to go further with those reforms, and I think, you know, in an ideal world, the time is right to continue those reforms and make further reforms against the New South Wales police that we've seen in very recent memory have acted, you know, particularly from up the top in quite an appalling way at times. But the idea of this is the red line, okay? This, like, because Chris Minns said he backs the New South Wales police, this is like why I need to break fellowship with the Labor Party. It's like, that's your own judgment to make for yourself. Don't let someone else say that's what it has to be for you. And I'd argue that the Labor Party is like, what does it base itself around? Like, what's the primary issue for the Labor Party? It's workers' rights, and it's making sure the workers get representation in Parliament. What I think is a far better strategy is to mount internal pressure. Bob Carr said this: your vote or your say is worth 1,000 times more if you're inside a major party than outside. Join your local branch, try and reform from the inside. Often when you join your local branch, you realize that it's not as simple as what you think, and that there are a lot of mitigating factors, and it helps just grow a bit of perspective. Third thing I'd say is that when you look at these big picture thinkers, they are like, they're not just giving concessions for the sake of giving concessions. They're not giving concessions because they're scared. It's giving concessions with a broader goal in mind. And I think what would be a fun exercise, I don't know, give it a go. If you've got some spare time, give it a go. You know how Rudd had his emissions trading scheme where you could buy carbon permits off of companies that had them in excess? What about a political capital trading scheme? Obviously, I'm not suggesting the government. Just have a go yourself of like, okay, these are the things that I want to implement, and let's just put a political cost of like 10 credits on this reform that would get this blowback and would trigger this response. Try and draw up a like system of how much it costs for each reform that you want to implement, and then have a go at trying to get the maximum return on investment. Like you said all the time with like sports things of like, or even like fantasy football, okay? If fantasy football isn't just pick the best team of all time, it's you've got a limited budget, how are you going to get the maximum return on your investment? I think really when it comes to politics, it's more a case of that than it is an exercise in your moral principles. There's 1,000 good things you could do in government. What can you get the maximum return on investment on to see those reforms entrenched over a long period of time rather than wound up by the next government, undone by the next government that comes in? So have a go at creating a political capital trading scheme or a political capital economy. How much does it cost for each thing and what can get you the maximum possible return? If you are going to give a concession, which in politics you do have to do, what can you get in return? And that is the framing I would encourage you to think about. Is not, oh, it's I'm somehow a weak or impotent politician because I'm giving concessions. It's what can I get in return? And that is the framework that we think about. Often when we think about concessions, we just go, oh, boo, thing we don't like. But the trade-off is that good politicians get something in return. And obviously the best politicians get things that help the country massively in return for those concessions. So ignore all of that. If you've listened to this, you're up to 24 minutes, ignore all of that. This is what this video is actually about. This video is actually about Revenge of the Sith. Star Wars Revenge of the Sith is the best Star Wars movie of all time. If you have any issues with George Lucas's dialogue, that is because you are unlearned and you don't understand the fine sophistication of the writing room that was George Lucas. That is what this video is actually about. If you have an issue with that, you are the problem.